Let me ask you a question to start off with this morning. Raise your hand if you've got life all figured out. I mean, we have a lot of older members in our congregation. Surely somebody in here has life all figured out, right? A lot of wisdom in this room this morning. Questions like, especially for the younger people, what am I here for? What's my purpose? Sit on your phone and scroll. No, that's not your purpose. That's not what you're here for. Sometimes we ask the questions like this: is this all there is to it? I mean, it's kind of like depressing when you read Solomon's writings, and it's like this is all there is to it. But no, there's more to it than that. There's more to it than cell phones and things like that. If you watch the news, I don't watch the news anymore. I don't care to look at the stuff that's going on in our world because it's depressing. It's pathetic and it's absolutely mind-blowing. And all I do when I hear something is just shake my head and say, how and why? And then another question I ask is, where's God in all this? Am I the only one, or have y'all said something similar? What is God doing in the midst of all this junk that's going on all around us in our world? How, and I've heard a lot of people say this, how is he letting things like this go on? You've heard that too? And I moved up on, have y'all heard Top of the World Community? I moved there a couple of weeks ago. And I was driving up the mountain, and this sermon idea came to my mind. And this is what I want to talk about this morning is what faith is. It's trusting God when things just don't make any sense. Because that's life, isn't it? That's why I started out by asking you, do you have life all figured out? Because, we could be on the mountaintop sometimes, and things are going great, and things are going good, and we're like, whoo, this is good stuff. But what happens? Something happens, something comes along, knocks our feet out from underneath us, and we're going, God, what's going on? Where are you at in all this? And so we kind of end up back down in the valley, and I want to stick with the resurrection since we're not too far removed from Easter, because this is the questions that I asked you would be some of the questions that the disciples would be asking, what in the world is going on? It doesn't matter that Jesus told them over and over again, many times, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to die, I'm going to be buried, and I'm going to rise again on the third day. When that event happened, when he was arrested and had that mock trial and was crucified, it absolutely blew their minds. And they couldn't figure it out. And if you think about it, they've been cruising through life for 3 to 3.5 years. I mean, can you imagine waking up every day with Jesus in your camp? And you're going to go into villages and you're going to watch him multiply bread and fish and heal people, lame to walk, deaf hear. You get to see him raise people from the dead and give them life again. I mean, they were absolutely cruising on this mountaintop experience for 3 to 3.5 years. And they're thinking the idea of with Jesus, their Messiah, they had no doubt that he was who he says he is. I don't believe they ever doubted that one bit. But they had a misconception of what the Messiah was going to do. And we'll get to this in a minute, but Jesus, he tried to allude to them what his mission was. Take up your cross and follow me daily. But they're thinking, this guy's going to, our Messiah, he's going to lead us, and he's going to literally sit on the throne of David. He's going to be reigning in power. These Romans are going to be run out of town, and the Jews are going to be reestablished back into power. And the disciples had that idea. The Jewish crowds that came to Jesus had that idea. You remember they chased him from one place to another after he fed the 5,000, and they wanted to make him a king. Because that's the idea they had of the Messiah, that he was going to be this great leader and lead them back into power. And the religious leaders had the same idea. That's why they could never accept Jesus, because this guy, Jesus, who claims to be the Messiah, in the religious leaders' eyes, he was born in a manger. laying in a barn with a bunch of animals, to a woman who was pregnant out of wedlock. I mean, they literally told Jesus, you're a son of an adulterer. They could not grasp this concept of who the Messiah was. And so going back to the disciples, they've been living on this mountaintop experience for 3.5 years. Now what? Their Messiah's been crucified. He's laying in a tomb. They saw, maybe if they were there, they deserted Jesus, every one of them. But if they come back around, they saw the spear pierce his side, and John says, out forth came blood and water. They saw Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus take Jesus' body off the tomb because none of them were man enough to do it. So these two rich men had to do it from the Sanhedrin. All their hope is gone. Their lives are in shambles. And now instead of being on this mountaintop they've been on for 3 to 3.5 years, they find themselves in this valley, and all they see is a gigantic rock. A gigantic rock. How'd they miss it? Especially after Jesus has told them many times. I don't know exactly how many times, but it's a lot. I'd say a good 8 to 10 times. Way before it was coming. When he says, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to die, I'm going to be buried, I'll raise again on the third day. How'd they miss it? One way is they were selfish. When Jesus would try to tell them that he was going to die, what were they concerned with? You remember? James and John, what did they do? Well, they went back fishing, but James and John got their mom involved in this thing. Can my boys, when you get to your kingdom, sit on your right and on your left? We want to be in power. We want to have honor in your kingdom. They were selfish. Peter would be the bold one and try to tell Jesus, he says, hey, this ain't happening, dude. I'm not going to let you die. And Jesus is trying to say, this is God's will. And he says, nope, this ain't happening. I'm not going to let this happen. You remember what Jesus called him? Get behind me what? Satan means opposition. Peter was opposing the will of God. This has got to happen. And yet after Peter sees Jesus arrested and be carried, he begins to have doubt and fear. In fact, he even tried to fight for Jesus, didn't he? He pulls out his sword there in the Garden of Gethsemane, and can't prove it's by the Bible, but I'd say, Frank, he was probably swinging for Malchus's head. And Malchus probably ducked, and he caught his ear and cut his ear off, and Jesus puts his ear back on. So he's full of doubt, and he's full of fear, and he begins to follow Jesus to see what's going to happen from a distance. Remember, he's warming himself by the fire, and somebody says, hey, what? You belong to that guy, that Jesus fellow, the one who claims to be the Messiah. Oh, I don't know him. I don't know him. 2 more times, a total of 3 times, Peter does what? He denies Jesus. In the 3rd time, go back and read the accounts, he's cussing. I'll tell you, I don't know the boop, 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 boop. There were some beeps in there, some explicitives coming out of Peter's mouth. I don't know this man. Why? Because he's full of doubt and fear. And then the rooster crows, and I can't remember which gospel it is, but it says that Jesus turned and looked. Can you imagine being Peter in this moment when that rooster crowed and you're looking at Jesus and he turns and looks at you eye to eye as he's about to go to the cross? I told you you were going to deny me. I'll never deny you. I'll die with you. All 12. Not just Peter. The Gospels say all 12 said the same thing, and that they wouldn't desert Jesus. But yet, here's Peter full of doubt and fear. And doubt and fear is exactly what happens to us when we're down in the valley. A lot of chaos, a lot of confusion, and we're going, what is going on, God? Why is this happening to me? Y'all ever said that? I said it a lot. Why is this happening to me? It just don't make any sense. And then we find the disciples, they're gathered behind locked doors in fear. They're freaking out. And I'm going to prove this to you in just a second, because if y'all want to turn to Luke 24, we're going to get there. We're going to read the story of the road to Emmaus. That's where we're going to be going. But they're behind locked doors. They're freaking out. They don't, even though Jesus has told them this is coming, they don't have any idea what to expect. And as a matter of fact, in Matthew 24, verse 9, just before Jesus was arrested, he told the disciples, he told them these encouraging words. He says, you're going to be arrested, you're going to be persecuted, and you're going to be killed. That's not very encouraging, is it? But that's what he told them just before he was arrested. You're going to be arrested, you're going to be persecuted, and you're going to be killed. And matter of fact, you're going to be hated all over the world because you follow me. That's what they're thinking about. That's why they're behind locked doors, because they're scared to death. They're full of fear and doubt. And we could just be a fly on the wall and hear the conversations they're having. Maybe they would ask something like this: how could this man who raised dead people back to life, how could he be dead? How could he be laying in a tomb right now? We thought he was the Messiah. We thought he was going to be leading us back into power. They still wrestle with this even after the resurrection. If you go read in Acts chapter 1, Jesus is saying, wait in Jerusalem, wait for the promise of my Father. But what are they concerned with? Are you going to restore the kingdom of Israel back to power? That's all they were concerned about. They didn't get it. But Jesus, like I said, had told them in Luke 9:23, he'd given them a warning that this was coming. He says, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. Now see, we know what this means because we have a story. I know how the story ends. How do we know how the story ends? We knew how it begins. We can read the beginning. And we can go to the book of Revelation and read the end. And we can go to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and see how it was in the middle. Because we have the whole story. They didn't have that. They were living it. They had the Old Testament scriptures they could read and know. And even though they had those, and even though Jesus said this is coming, they didn't get it. It was, that you see people go, whoop. It went over their heads all the time. They were living it. They had no clue what was going on, and all they could see was the image that has been etched into their brain of Jesus' body beaten to a pulp before he ever went to the cross. Isaiah 52 says you wouldn't even recognize him, that he was even a man. So, yeah, the Passion of the Christ, if you've seen that movie, Mel Gibson did a good job. But I can almost guarantee you that what Jesus went through was probably 10 times worse than what Jim Caviezel went through making that movie. They would see this image of Jesus beaten up. They would see him struggling to breathe on a cross. They would hear him crying out to God, Lama, Lama, Sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? They would hear as Jesus takes his last breath, what did Jesus say? Father, what? Forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. And they didn't. Don't know what you're doing. They literally didn't know. They didn't understand it. All they can see is this gigantic rock. And they've lost all hope. They can't see. If y'all, how many of you have been to the top of the world? And you just go straight from the church building here and go out, right? That's the view that you come through. That's why I stopped and took that picture. That's all you see when you get out to the end of Montvale here, is that big old rock. And we'll talk more about this in a minute, but when you start climbing the rock, all you see is a lot of trees until you get toward the top. But all they could see was this gigantic rock. All right, Luke chapter 24, verses 13 and following, it says the same day, this is the road to Emmaus. This is going to give us, this is what's so cool about this story. And Luke is the only one that gives this story. And Luke, when you read the book of Luke, the very first chapter, Luke says, I'm getting this from eyewitnesses. And that's when you read Luke, Luke gives a lot of detail in his stories. And he does that for us. So we can literally go back in time and see what these people were dealing with when Jesus was in that tomb. The same day, two of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. So we see there's your details. It's 7 miles from Jerusalem. They're walking from Jerusalem back to Emmaus. And they're tore all to pieces. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that happened. And as they talked, they discussed these things. Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with him. And you're like, yes, this is awesome. But, verse 16, God kept them from recognizing that it was Jesus. And so he asked them, what are you discussing so intently as you walk along? So this stranger just pops up out of nowhere and asks them, what's going on? Why are y'all talking so intently? They stopped short. Sadness written all across their faces. And then one of them, and we actually have somebody's name, Cleopas, replied, you must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened there the last few days. What's wrong with you, fellas? Where you been? That's what he's saying. Where have you been, dude? Do you not know what's happened? Jesus says, not knowing that it's Jesus. This is what's so cool about the story. He's playing with them, and he's just toying with these guys. What things, Jesus asked? The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth, they said. Now, I want you to listen to how they speak here. He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. Now listen to this. This is key right here. Show you they're in a valley and show you that all they can see is this gigantic rock, and they had lost hope. Verse 21. We had hope. They literally say the words. We had hope. We lost all hope because he's laying there in the tomb. We saw it. We saw him die. We saw him buried. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. And this all happened 3 days ago. And then some of the women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. You read John chapter 20, the first few verses. A bunch of the Marys go to the tomb. They were taking spices to the tomb to put it on Jesus' stinky body because it's been 3 days. They were going to get somebody to roll the stone back. And what happens when they get there? The stone's away. It's been rolled away. Jesus' body's gone. Mary's freaking out. She's crying. And she has a conversation with Jesus. She thinks he's the gardener. And finally, he calls her by name. And she grabs him by his legs. And he says, don't cling to me. But here's what you need to do, Mary. Go back and tell my brothers and sisters that I'm alive. I try to tell y'all this is going to happen. It's happened. I'm alive. So she runs back and she tells the disciples, John and Peter, run to the tomb and check things out. Sure enough, the tomb is empty. And that's when Peter says, I'm going fishing. This is blowing my mind. I can't make any sense of all this. But even though Jesus had told them it was coming, they didn't get it. They didn't get it. And that's what, here's Cleopas rehearsing this story to this stranger who is actually Jesus. And he says, some women went from our group of his followers were at the tomb early this morning. They came back with an amazing... Y'all, they ain't seen nothing like this before. We see it all the time in movies, so we don't think a whole lot about it. But that's make-believe. This ain't make-believe. It's the real deal. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels who told them that Jesus is alive. And that, if you go back and read John chapter 20, those first few verses, Mary's having a conversation with two angels sitting in the tomb, and she just turns and walks away nonchalantly. And she sees Jesus when he was the gardener, thinking he was a gardener. What are you going to do when you're having conversations with angels? I'm freaking out. She didn't think nothing of it, evidently. So she has this conversation with the angels, and they said that Jesus is alive. Verse 24, some of our men ran out to see. That would be John and Peter. And sure enough, his body was gone, just as the woman had said. It's not that they believed, that Peter and John believed that Jesus had risen from the grave, because they didn't understand it. When you go back and read John 20, it says they believed. They believed Mary's story. See, back in the Bible days, women couldn't testify in court. Their testimony would not hold up. And it's real interesting that God would use a woman to be the first person to tell he's alive. And so they had to go check this out for themselves, because after all, you think about it, Mary Magdalene had demons at one time. That woman's crazy. And so they go running to the tomb and they check it out for themselves. And yep, sure enough, he's gone, just as the women had said. And Jesus said to them, you foolish people, you find it hard, so hard to believe that all the prophets wrote in the Scriptures. Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory? And then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses. Remember, they're on a 7-mile journey. They had plenty of time to talk. Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the Scriptures the things concerning himself. And by this time, they were nearing Emmaus, and at the end of the journey, Jesus acted those if he were going to keep going, but they begged him, and remember, they don't know that it's Jesus. And so they beg him, stay the night with us since it's getting late. And so he went home. All right, let's stop there, and we'll come back to this at the end of the lesson. Why would these two men ask a stranger to come in their home with them? It is hospitality. Try that today. It's pretty dangerous in our day and time. But they were practicing hospitality. But this man to them, even though it was Jesus, he is a complete stranger that literally popped out of nowhere and had a conversation with them. And if you think about it, they have witnessed their best friend, their Messiah, be murdered, brutally murdered. They've been hanging out with other followers for 3 days, trying to figure out what's going on. Some of the other disciples, they've been hanging out with them for 3 days and trying to make sense of it all. And all of a sudden, this stranger pops in out of nowhere and begins having a conversation. What are y'all talking about? What's going on? What do you mean, what's going on? Where have you been? You're the only person in Jerusalem and all of this area that even knows that about Jesus? And then they tell him about Jesus. And then this stranger starts talking about Moses and all the prophets and all these Old Testament scriptures. What do you do when a loved one passes away? You mourn. You have a visitation. We have a funeral service. And who shows up to these services? Family you ain't seen in years, right? And as families gather together, what happens? Start rehearsing memories, right? And you start talking about all of these memories. Well, I think that's what's going on here. They're trying to figure things out and make sense of it all. This stranger pops up, starts talking about the prophets and Moses and all these scriptures, and I think they're starting to think about things, and it starts bringing back all these memories of all these things that Jesus has done. And they found comfort. They found comfort talking with this strange man who actually happened to be Jesus. But if you look at their language, they were talking in past tense. You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all these things. The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth. He was a prophet. He did miracles. He was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. Our leading priests, and religious leaders, they handed him over. They condemned him to death. They crucified him. We had hope. We've lost all hope, dude. I don't know who you are, strange man, that don't know what's going on. I don't know how you missed it. This guy's been here for 3.5 years doing all these miracles, doing all these great things. We had hoped that he was the Messiah, but he's crucified. He's been buried. And they're thinking that this man has some answers that may comfort them, in my opinion. I love this story that Luke gives us because, like I said a while ago, we have an inside look at the struggle that these disciples were literally having. When you read this passage, you just sit down and read it through without my commentary. You can actually feel their pain. You can see the sadness on their faces. And they're talking with this stranger. We can literally see as they're walking this 7-mile journey, their countenance changed from sadness to maybe, thinking about these memories, it's making me smile, at least just for a little while. And they didn't understand what just happened, but this stranger saw some hope. See this sign? This sign is on the way to my house on top of the world. That sign says, if you can't see it, glimpse for a moment some of the magnificence of our Creator. As I said a while ago, as you're driving from here, from the church building and going out Montville, all you can see is the big rock. But as you start to climb the mountain, and I wanted to show a video. I made a couple of videos, but I didn't want to confuse Gloria up there. You're welcome, Gloria. And I didn't know how to really get it to work through my sermon. It was going to be a big mess. I didn't want to mess anything up. But as you're walking, I'm sorry, you don't want to walk up that mountain, trust me. As you're driving up the mountain, the trees are thick right now. But as you get to higher elevations, there starts to be breaks in the trees. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Y'all lived in the mountains probably your whole life. I've only been here for a little while, about 10 or 12 years, so I'm still fascinated by it. And as you get to these breaks in the trees, you see glimpses of what? Mountains for days, right? And it's very beautiful. And we went on the parkway yesterday, and there's literally pull-offs every so often where you can pull off and just look, and you can just see mountains and mountains and mountains on a clear day. It's glimpses, if you will. And those glimpses, as we climb the mountain, they give us hope. They help us to endure. They help us to keep going because we want so we can see the most beautiful view that God has created. And going back to his disciples, Jesus' disciples, they experienced the very same thing that you and I face in life on many occasions. We've had this thing happen in our life. Some events come along. We've lost a loved one. We've lost our job. Fill in the blank with whatever it is. And it throws us for a loop. It just brings chaos in our life. And we're like, what is going on? Why me? Where are you at in all this, God? I don't understand. And all we can see is this gigantic rock. And yet we endure. We keep going on the journey. And we keep climbing the mountain. And even though it's filled with all these things that obscure our views, y'all ever heard the phrase, can't see the forest from the trees? That's what I'm talking about. We're full of fear, we're full of doubt, but yet we continue. And as we keep going, as we keep enduring, and we're going along this journey, God shows us glimpses. I'll give you some examples. How many times have you been in a valley, down and out, wondering where God's at, and a certain song comes on the radio? Or you read something. Or a scripture just pops out of nowhere. I splurged a little bit and bought me a Mustang convertible the other day. And I was driving down the highway, and I never paid attention to this, and there's a air freshener hanging on the door. I don't know who hangs air fresheners on the door. I thought you hang them from the mirror. But there was a cross. And it had a certain scripture on it. And I was like, well, isn't that cool? Because that scripture, I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But it ministered to me. But it was a glimpse. A certain song. Spencer Garner is one of the main people in this church that does what I'm about to say. I'm sorry to call you out, Spencer. But you know, this man will send an encouraging, y'all probably got them from him. He's always sending out these encouraging texts. It's a glimpse. It's a glimpse. It keeps us going. It could be a bumper sticker. It could be something that somebody says in the grocery store line. Glimpses. Glimpses. God uses these glimpses to bring us hope, to bring us encouragement, so that we can keep going. And that's what faith is all about. Hebrews 11:1 says that faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It's the evidence of things that we cannot see. We can't see God. Scriptures makes that clear. We cannot see God, but we can see His fingerprints. Romans says we can see His handiwork. In Romans 1:18-20, Paul writes, "But God shows His anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because He has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky that God created," right? Genesis 1. By speaking a word. That's how powerful He is. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. No excuse. Because we can't see God Himself, but we can see everything that He's done. In other words, He gives us glimpses. And we keep going because we have hope. 1 Timothy 4:10, Paul says, "This is why we work hard and continue to struggle." And if anybody knows anything about struggling, it's Paul. "For our hope is in the living God, who is the Savior of all people, and particularly of all believers." And so these disciples had lost all hope but yet they're continuing the journey. And for these two right here, it was awesome. They're walking with Jesus, and they're about to figure that out. Let's go back to Luke 24 and look at verse 30. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and he blessed it. They still don't know it's Jesus. It's just some stranger danger. As they sat down to eat, he took the bread and blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them, and suddenly their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And at that moment, he disappeared. I love that. They said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and explained the Scriptures to us?" And within the hour, they were on their way back to Jerusalem. And there they found the 11 disciples and the others who had gathered with them, who said, "The Lord has really risen. He appeared to Peter." Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus appeared to them, and they were walking along the road, and how they recognized him as he was breaking bread. And just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself suddenly standing there among them and says, "Peace be with you." I mean, he just pops in on the scene. "Peace be with you." But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking that they were seeing a ghost. "Why are you frightened?" Jesus asked. "Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands. Look at my feet." So in other words, you can still see the scars from the nails. Look at my hands. Look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. They ain't seen anything like this before. They're freaked out. "Touch me and make sure that I'm not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies as you see that I do." And as he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. And still they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. And then he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" Well, surely a dead man or a ghost is not going to be hungry. So he says, "I'll prove it to you. This is me. You got any fish?" And they gave him a piece of broiled fish. Poor thing, it should have been fried. They gave him a piece of broiled fish. I hope it was catfish. And he ate it as they watched. And then he said, "When I was with you before, I told you that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. And he said, "Yes, it was written long ago that the Messiah would suffer and die and rise from the dead on the third day. It was also written that this message would be proclaimed in the authority of his name to all the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. There is forgiveness of sins for all who repent. You are witnesses of all these things, and now I will send the Holy Spirit just as my Father promised. Stay here in the city until the Holy Spirit comes and fills you with power from heaven." And then Jesus led them to Bethany, and lifting his hands to heaven, he blessed them, and while he was blessing them, he became an airplane. He started floating. He was taken up to heaven, and so they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem filled with great joy. So their doubt and fear has now turned to what? Joy. They spent all their time in the temple praising God. So you can see the joy, right? You can literally see the countenance of these two men and the disciples, the other disciples. You can see the countenance on their face turn from sadness to joy. There's a song that we used to sing. I don't know if y'all ever sing it here or not. It's called "This Is How We Overcome." It's by Hillsong. And it says, "Your light broke through my night and restored exceeding joy. Your grace fell like rain and made this desert live. You have turned my mourning into dancing. You have turned my sorrow into joy." And from this point on, many of the followers of Jesus are going to suffer just like Jesus said. They're arrested. They suffer persecution. Many of them are killed for their faith. You know, we see that Stephen being stoned. We see James beheaded. There's some things you might not know, just to give you an interesting fact. There was this Roman emperor named Nero who would take Christians who were still alive and bury them up to their head and drive his chariots over them for funsies. Or he would take Christians who were still alive and pour oil on their bodies, tie it to a pole, and light up his gardens. These people went through bad things, very bad things. But the band, y'all want to come on back up? We're going to end it right here. I don't want to leave you in the valley. I want to bring you back up to the mountaintop. Because like the disciples, you know what it's like to be in a valley. For the disciples on this day, it was the cross. And they have seen glimpses. Jesus has made these appearances off and on. Paul says that he appeared to many, and he appeared to over 500 people. So there was glimpses along the way that would encourage them to keep going and not quit. And now they have seen what's on the other side, because Jesus has been resurrected. They couldn't get enough of it. They have literally experienced the resurrected Jesus. And there's a lot of people in our world today that have experienced Jesus, but they have not experienced the resurrected Jesus. What I mean by that is there's a lot of people that know Jesus, but they've never had a relationship with the resurrected Jesus. And there's a huge, huge difference. Because once you experience the resurrected Jesus, it will change your life. If you have experienced the resurrected Jesus, see the mountain on the screen there? That's the view, one of the views, right beside my house. It's beautiful. Very beautiful. I think I took that pic from the parkway. Literally a minute from my driveway. Very beautiful. There was one of the churches I preached at full time was in Burnsville, North Carolina. A little bitty old Church of Christ, 20 people. And there was a guy by the name of Vern there. You ask Vern, how you doing today, Vern? I'm on the green side of the grass. That's good. And we'd go visit Vern, his wife. Vern had, I think it was COPD. The guy had a mansion. I mean, literally, it was a ginormous house on the side of a mountain. And anywhere you were at in Vern's house, especially if you're in the yard, you saw views even better than this. Mountains for weeks. Very beautiful. And Vern looked at me one day when we were visiting. He says, because he couldn't even walk across the living room. He says, Randy, I was talking about how pretty his view was. He says, when you live here long enough, you don't even see the mountains anymore. And I thought, is that true? That's sad. I don't want to ever be that way. I want to always see the mountains. I don't want to just see glimpses. I want the whole thing. And my question to you, if you've known Jesus for a long time, you still see the mountains. How's your relationship with Jesus, in other words? And I want to end with just reading Hebrews 12, 1 through 3. We're going to sing Oceans. I want to give an invitation. You've never given your life to Jesus Christ. And like Zach, the baptism tank is warm this morning. 2 p.m. on a Wednesday night, it's cold as that. But if you do have a relationship with Jesus, but it's not where you want it to be, I pray today that God will start showing you glimpses of Him once again and bring you back up to the mountain and you can see these. Hebrews 12, beginning in verse 1. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and now he is seated at the place of honor beside God's throne. Think of all the hostility he endured from simple people. Then you won't become weary and give up. Let's stand.